I'm going to talk about platform variance around the world. This is a bit of a step back from the news of the day, and it's having a little look at how much has changed in recent years insofar as discovery and verification goes. That's what we at Factual do. We discover and verify real-time incident information and news. We do so with a source agnostic platform, which allows us to collate and identify breaking news events across a wide range of sources all over the world in multiple languages, regardless of what platform they're on. But what platform they're on is very important, and that sort of thing has changed. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. We're living through a very intense period of change for how information is discovered and verified. It's only a few years ago that analysts in risk intelligence and a lot of journalists, to be honest, would be sitting watching what was then called Twitter for updates on live events. And that has changed radically. And we live in a very different world now from when that was the most you really needed to do to see what was happening at any given time. So we'll talk a little bit about how that's the case. We'll also talk a bit about polarization and how social media sources have splintered across platforms, new platforms, multimedia platforms, private and encrypted platforms. This ecosystem is a very complicated mix of public and private, open and closed, and politically segmented. This has been an especially big trend as political uncertainty has really ramped up in the last few years. And then we're going to look at how this context impacts how we cover very specific stories. Tyler has shared that slide earlier about what our most active topics are at the moment on the Factor site. I'll talk a little bit about a couple of those big ones at the top there. And yeah, covering wars is a big part of our job. It requires working experience of a very large variety of platforms at one time. You need local media literacy, you need language expertise. So we'll talk a little bit about how information moves in real time across multiple platforms on one particular subject in one particular place. And then something that you can't, when we talk about variance, you can't avoid is talking about what happens in countries where information is not free, right? Press freedoms are restricted to varying degrees all over the world. And it's imperative to really understand how that impacts variance. Social media sites are generally going to reflect the local press and political censorship environments of the countries in which they operate. Nowhere shows this more than China, which has its own completely separate social media ecosystem and a state-controlled media environment. So we'll take a look at how we cover incidents in places like that and why journalism is so important.
I think we're on to the changing face of discovery and
That's
verification.
correct, yes. And these are a few contextual forces that are at play in today's chaotic information environment. And it's important to note these for risk intelligence in general. I think that is self-evident for anyone who operates in needing to use the media in the United States. It is also very obvious in places like Western Europe, South America, pretty global politicization. It's a catalyst for a whole host of changes to where users go when news breaks, how information is shared, and even how it's interpreted by intermediaries. And we also have a new and unpredictable host of regulatory issues that impact usage. You guys might remember last year, Brazil banned X for a month after a protracted legal battle. And that had a big impact on how people used it in Brazil at the time. We've got age bans in places like Australia. There's a wide variety of moderation regulation in different countries. And in Brazil, after they did a ban of X for that month, saw user group migration. So people moving to new platforms, different platforms, driven onto Instagram, Threads, or driven to places like Blue Sky. So we've seen user group migrations because of these political and regulatory issues. This creates a very high degree of complexity across platforms. I think one of the first most important questions we ask ourselves is, where should I look? Something happens and it's like, where should I look first? Not necessarily what am I looking for? Because there's a great deal of segmentation as to how these things happen. It almost goes without saying that we live through a very noisy era that's fraught with mis and disinformation. It's harder than ever to identify reliable narrators, credible sources in this vast ocean of noise. And that brings us to the last point here, which is the verification imperative. Journalistic experience really helps in cutting a path through these forces, and verifying has become more important than ever. So polarization and balkanization is how we frame this. Risk intelligence professionals have to keep retooling to identify the changes here. Social media is seeing what cable news started to see in the early 2000s, which is the politicization of the platforms themselves and the splitting of audiences and users along political lines. Facebook and X have become highly polarized after abandoning some of their previous moderation initiatives, and they've warmed somewhat to the Trump administration's position on online speech, which has created a much more contentious environment and it's driven people elsewhere. The President of the United States uses his own social media site to make announcements about world events, which at the very least is indicative of how changed our online world really is from just a few years ago. Many left-leaning users have migrated to new places like Blue Sky, Threads, Mastodon in pretty big numbers. Nothing, no sort of one major migration, but like lots of little ones. And it's also, and perhaps to a greater impact, created this massive growth in the rise of private, often encrypted chat apps as information centers. So WhatsApp, Telegram channels are now very standard sources for information. We'll get to that in a second as well. Next slide, please. This is a quick one. Let's take a look at the trends. These graphs should show you, if you can see them, that social media has overtaken traditional formats entirely as the main source of news for people. But within social media, the traditional dominance, the likes of Facebook, YouTube, or X, as sources of news, those are decreasing. The big platforms are ceding market share, if you will, to short form video sites, new sites like Blue Sky, and chat apps. The chat apps aren't really represented there in full, but that is a big piece of it. And this creates the complex media environment that requires a pretty diligently platform agnostic approach to discovering and verifying, which is what we do. Next slide, please. And here is where we do it. The Middle East conflict is our biggest story, has been for the last couple of years. It's our most active topic. It's one that generates an enormous amount of real world impact to real people, also having a huge political and military consequence that ricochets around the world every week. In the last year, we've come to the brink of wider regional war more than once. We've come close to thinking that there might be peace. We're there again this week. There's a lot of uncertainty about what happens next. This quote here is from our MENA lead. This is Ahmed Namatala, and he's a very experienced reporter on the ground from the Middle East, and he is clear here. He says there's never been a single platform that has proven reliable in covering the Middle East and North Africa in an accurate, timely, and in-depth manner. So we are immersed in multiple platforms and multiple sources at any one given time. Traditional media platforms have a wide but uneven reach in the Middle East. So Facebook is still very influential. That dates back to the Arab Spring, or what was known at the time as the Facebook Revolution. We still see live streaming on Facebook as a very major medium for news here, and that's often live streams from locations that nobody else will be. There's a strong Arabic language broadcast media environment with some very well sourced and independent coverage of some of the hard hit regions. Al Jazeera does a great job in lots of places. But there are other semi official kinds of networks that have become most critical as sources. So I'm thinking particular places like Sudan and Syria, where you have a very degraded civil environment. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, civil society groups, trade unions, human rights organizations, these often serve as primary sources on big breaking news stories. And they might live on X or Facebook or Telegram or combinations of those, but it's important to know where they are and how to use them. Telegram is increasingly popular in the Middle East, especially in Israel-Palestine, Israel-Lebanon, Israel-Iran conflicts. We use them a lot, but I think I'd be paraphrasing Ahmed correctly by saying covering this part of the world is about knowing which sources are closest to the story and then knowing what platforms they tend to use. So we look for Lebanese sources for stories about Lebanon, Iranian sources for stories about Iran, and there are exceptions as to how these stories break into the social media news world, but the rule of thumb is the closer the sources to the story, the more reliable it will be in an environment such as this. Next slide, please. So this is a very different war zone and a very different social media environment. This is Ukraine, Russia, our second most used is the wrong word, our second most popular, also not a great word, our second most active topic. Telegram accounts for the overwhelming majority of our coverage of all things Russia and Ukraine. It accounts for more than 95% of our Ukraine-Russia war updates. which is now tens and tens of thousands since the war started 3.5 years ago. You'll see on the table on the right there, that's five of our like most cited sources. You've got two Russian media outlets there. You've got the Ukrainian Air Force. You've got the governor of Zaporizhia Oblast, and you have a Ukrainian local news site. Those are all discovered on Telegram. And our Europe lead, Alex Moore, describes Telegram as vibrant and vast, enabling very quick detection and verification of events because of this sheer size of the source population. So, in this particular corner of the world, there's huge breadth of source types. There's official, military, eyewitness, aggregators, local media, and they're all in the same place, which is every single one. There's always exceptions to every rule, but Telegram has a very healthy representation of all those different types of sources, which means when something breaks, an eyewitness report breaks, finding some sort of official corroboration within Telegram is very straightforward. It often snowballs inside Telegram. There's also interesting sort of new kinds of source types. So Telegram creates a space for this sort of new sort of semi-official security blogger type figure, which has proven to be extremely reliable when you know what stories they're reliable on. It takes experience and practice, but some of them are connected to Russian or Ukrainian security services. Others take public submissions and serve as a kind of community notice board, but they are fast and reliable. And again, everything needs verification, but that's quite easy. Easy is never easy, but it's quite a streamlined way to do that is through Telegram on this particular story because there's such a diverse source population. Again, environments without media freedom. Here I'm quoting our APAC lead, that's Vivian, and she says the most important consideration in covering news in China is understanding what the government's priorities are at any given moment and knowing how that impacts how reporting happens. Covering an environment that does not have press freedom brings an entire new dimension to the platforms and to the sources and a new set of challenges. When news breaks in China, it moves very quickly through a series of native social media channels which require their own expertise to navigate. Almost all media in China is government owned or controlled, and official organs of the state are very well represented on the most influential social media platforms. Most things, not again, not all, there's always an exception, but most things in China will break on WeChat or Weibo, and then they start turning up on Baidu, which is the China's main search engine. And that's the general flow of how information moves on a big story. But of course, the Chinese government has a high degree of control over how this happens. So when they're incentivized to encourage a free flow of information, like in floods, typhoons, earthquakes, landslides, where the government's response is in the government's response is part of the sort of incentive to talk about it. They can facilitate the free flow of information in many situations. Actually, to high impact, they're very well represented, as I say, on social media, and they can move information pretty quick. But coverage can follow a very different cadence. When the story is more sensitive, criticism of the government is routinely suppressed. And when an incident is controversial or it reflects poorly on people in power or poorly on the response of the government to any particular issue, the information will move pretty differently. And what tends to happen is it will just move slowly. It's not a sort of total censorship environment to the extent that there's a lot of people and a lot of cameras, and you can't like necessarily pretend something didn't happen at all, but you can definitely slow it down. So sensitive stories will generally break on the government's time. And it requires experience to read between the lines as to what it is they actually say. There's also a unique source environment in the sort of China coverage region, which is the sort of dissident, often diaspora China watcher accounts that will run aggregator accounts on Telegram or X that can be very helpful for covering China when there's a story that the government really doesn't want to talk about or is being slow to talk about. Like everything, it needs to be verified, but that can be a very helpful way to work around state dominance. So there is a sort of more extreme version of this, which is there are a few places it's hard to reach in the world as Myanmar. And as Vivian says, again, we really depend on the people who are dedicated to independent journalism in places like this. Coverage in Myanmar depends entirely almost on the people who still report from inside and outside of the country, despite the extreme challenges of doing so. Facebook and Telegram are both used, but the military government often shuts the internet down completely or they block the use of VPNs. It makes internet access pretty unreliable and often dangerous. Real reporting is really absolutely essential for people interested in finding out what's happening live in Myanmar. We'd be almost blind without it. And it's a reminder to us all that journalism matters hugely here, but also everywhere. History is told by those who report it, and ground level news coverage and press freedom are essential. So, my final slide then is just a 4 points, core principles, first principles approach to how you navigate this changing world. So we're in a constantly evolving high variance world, and good information is getting harder to find. And there's not an immediate solution to that particular conundrum. So what do we do? First thing we always try to remember is you go where the story goes. Fragmentation, flux in the platform landscape, that's the new normal. It's now part of the job of looking for good information, is keeping ahead of the changes in social media companies themselves, staying across regulatory change, some of the ownership psychodrama, and seeing how user networks react to that and where they go, how they migrate when unexpected stuff happens. The next would be the news media literacy, understanding the media environment. Social media platforms will, to an extent, always reflect the idiosyncrasies of the media environment in the country they operate in, or the country where the news is emerging from. You have to get to know the underlying media environments in each place. If it's a censored place, who's left reporting inside the country, who's left outside the country, where do they gather, where do they publish? Get to know the sources specifically and by name. And cutting through the noise by thinking like a journalist. And actually, that is not as hard as it might sound. It's actually a couple of very key questions. Age-old ones. Is this narrator reliable? Is there a second credible source to corroborate this first one? These basic checks on new details will save you a lot of time and stress. So they're essential now for journalists, as they always have been, and analysts as well. And then thinking local. I think prioritizing sources that are closest to the incident is a rule that really actually doesn't vary around the world. It's one of the few that applies everywhere. There are some exceptions, again, like there are to all good rules, but sticking as close as possible to where the incident has happened is likely to leverage the best results. And so, in conclusion, I say to you that the answer in the real world is the same as the answer in risk intelligence analysis, and that is more journalism. Thank you very much.